Hello, and just sitting here chatting away. Hello and welcome to the first panel session from the NetZero stage. I'm joined by a selection of experts, like the best of the best, the creme de la creme that I could find just hanging around last night in the bar before we decided to come down. We're going to be discussing, in this session specifically, we're going to be discussing the counting of carbon in a comparative way to the counting of money, although some could say that the construction industry is quite famous for not counting money very well, as we usually go over budget on everything. But before we get started, if you gentlemen can just introduce yourselves, I'll pass my microphone to Chris first.
Thank you, Matthew. No relation,
No.
right? I just want that to be out there straight away. Chris Jackson, Matthew Jackson, no relation. So Chris Jackson, I'm with Esri. We're a provider of geographic information systems technology, primarily related around digital mapping and overlaying lots of contextual information. And in the context of this conference, we're here because we believe that designers need to design in context. You know, we hear lots of engineers and designers still thinking about their infrastructure or their asset in isolation and not taking into account both the natural and the human environments in which their asset is due to operate. So we have a long history of providing that sort of capability and technology to support the analysis of land, of natural resources, of human movement, of society in the context of mapping. And that's what we're interested in bringing to the table to give context to design. So yeah, we've been in the ESRI, by the way, stands for the Environmental Systems Research Institute.
I didn't know that that's what it meant.
There you go, you see, fun fact. Fun fact, fans. Pub quiz, yeah. So our history is in environmental science, and that still runs through our product development methodology and in a lot of the work that we get involved with. So yeah, here to talk about carbon in the natural environment, not necessarily in a block of concrete.
Thanks very much. Hi everyone, my name is Eamon Shields. I'm the Programme Manager for Commercial Retrofit for SEAI. Anyone who's not aware, SEAI is Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, so we are responsible, we're a public body and we're responsible for implementing the carbon targets that the government released. So obviously a lot of stuff is dictated by the EU, so we joined the EU and coming up with the different measures that we're going to implement throughout the EU, and then when it comes back, the government does a list of it and then hands it to us to make it happen. So we're involved in everything from domestic renovation, public sector renovation, and obviously the commercial renovation, which is what I'm involved in. So it's a massive challenge, obviously, because I traditionally come from I've spent 20 years in the M&E consultancy service, where you design a job and go to that job and follow that job through the process. SEI, I don't physically carry out any projects, so what we do is incentivize, educate and incentivize, so it's quite a different system and can be quite challenging because you essentially create something and then launch it into the environment and hope that people are going to be incentivized to take it up. So it's been very positive in the last couple of years in terms of the domestic sector, but we have a lot of challenges on the commercial side. So yeah, that's why I'm here. Thank you.
An ice cream cone would be nice in this heat. My name is Archie O'Donnell. I'm an architectural technologist by background, with a planning degree as well. And my area of interest is sustainability. And for a long time, I've really been challenged by how to actually get information out of a building, out of a design team, and turn that into some kind of useful quantitative data that we can use for sustainability. For too long, sustainability has been about badging, about, I got a LEED Gold, I got a B or C, but increasingly it's started to become a more holistic understanding that what is the impact of my building on the climate, knowing that buildings are 40% of carbon emissions, and how can I use that information to be better, to clean up my building, to make the building industry better. So I work for a company called Cosmos. They're a Danish company, and they're all about the metrics. They're all about, the quantities. They're all about collaboration. So I'm interested to speak to people afterwards about how do you actually get that data? How do you get that information? Okay.
Very nice. So we're going to, just a quick word to everybody online. I'm not being rude on my phone. I'm actually checking your questions as they come in. So if you want to ask questions live into the panel, we'll do our best to pick them up, if possible. So we're here talking about counting stuff. People have opinions about how good we are at counting stuff already as an industry, and it's mixed at best. But I mean, like, one of the things that, one of the big challenges that we have, first of all, is how are we going to count this stuff? How are we going to count carbon? What are the steps we need to take? And I guess really the first question is kind of like, what do you see as sort of the barriers of why we're not doing this yet? Why are we not counting carbon in the same way that we count budgetary money in a euro, pound, dollar sense? So who wants to go first in answering that question?
I have the microphone, so I suppose I have the conch, so I'm going to take it over. So I think to answer your question, the fact that the carbon isn't being counted in the same manner is, I think it's simply the fact that it isn't linked to money is the problem. Like, coming from 20 years in the commercial sector, if there's no associated euro value to doing something, you can't convince anybody to do it. Like, I was an M&E consultant for 20 years, and everyone wants to see the renewable option. And we show the client the renewable option, and then the QS walks into the room and says, well, the last building was 25 euro a metre squared, and this is 35 euro a metre squared. Why is that? And we say, well, because we did this. So then the client says, well, don't do that then. So that's basically the fact. Until the counting of carbon is either a regulatory requirement or it's linked. There's either a cost for not doing it, or there's a benefit to do it. So, for example, if the tenants who were going into these large buildings, similar to what you were talking about, Archie, in terms of LEED. So nobody ever counted waste, let's say. Nobody ever checked how much waste was recycled. And like, we could talk about, the waste on fit outs all day long. Like, the fact that most buildings in Ireland, new builds, are still done to Cat A, where the whole installation is installed. All the fan coils, all the ceiling tiles, absolutely everything gets installed, purely because the agent has told the client that if you're trying to sell this building, you kind of want a client to walk in and see what it's going to look like. So the whole thing gets fitted out, as opposed to going shell and core and not fitting out anything. But in reality, an architect comes along, of course, and it's an open plan office, and now the person wants 25 meeting rooms, 13 of this, a tea station, and the skip loads that leave that building are it's a sin, like, to see it. But the fact is that nobody cares, and it's not being tracked. And when LEED came along and they turned around and said, okay, well, you get 3 points, for example, depending on how much of the stuff you pull out can be recycled. Straight away, the construction industry had a system for doing it. Separate skips, everything was put in, because they knew that the client was going to kill them if they lost those 3 points. So,
also in some countries there was a fee for tonnage going to landfill as well. When that was introduced, late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
Oh, all of a sudden we know what to do with this stuff instead of sending it to landfill.
Exactly.
I don't want to pay tonnage cost.
Exactly.
It just appeared.
Yeah. So link the carbon to there's no greater God than cost on the commercial sector. And this isn't a cynical view on the commercial sector. It's called the commercial sector. Like, the clue is in the name.
It's called capitalism. I mean,
yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
Interesting. Archie, Chris, who?
Yeah. So I suppose you got to look at what's the incentive here, and it's that balancing act between, you've got the carrot and stick approach. So you've got the regulator on one side that's saying, if you don't do this, you don't have a functioning building. And then on the incentive side, someone is saying, if you can be better at sustainability, if your building can be greener, we'll give you cheaper finance or we'll give you higher rents. So there is that incentive side. What we're seeing is that in the climate crisis, it's perhaps the finance industry that's been asked to be the cavalry and appear over the hill. You know, they're the Prussian cavalry coming to the rescue. But, you know, is that right? What do they actually need? Does the finance industry need leaner, more sustainable, healthier buildings that have better social infrastructure, that have better air quality? Or are they really just concerned about the risk of their investment? So it is primarily risk, but what we're seeing is that a lot of projects that are at the financing stage have set themselves a really high bar for sustainability metrics. So you'll see that the EU has a taxonomy or a dictionary of sustainability, and it says, if you don't comply with our definition of sustainability, you're not sustainable, and therefore you can't. You might have LEED or BREEAM, or you might have a good B or like an EPC score, but unless you meet our specific definition of sustainability, you're not eligible to call your building a sustainable or a green building. Now, the impact that has, that for some investments, they say they're deep green. So the finance industry loves its acronyms, and they call them the SFDR Article 9.3 deep green investments. They will say, it took me an hour to learn that off.
I mean, I love new acronyms. I mean, it's one of my favorite or / least favorite things.
Yeah, it's an alphabet soup, that whole ESG area. So I might as well say what ESG is. It's environmental, social and governance factors that have to be considered in an investment. But that's really governing our built environment now, because the finance flows that are going into the built environment are categorized this way. And for some investment companies, they're saying, well, the one that we're concerned about is Paris-aligned goals. And we want to make sure that this building is tracking the decarbonisation agenda. So decarbonisation, you can imagine it as a ceiling that's coming down, and your carbon footprint has to reduce within that every year to 2050. What they're asking is, what carbon footprint is this building going to be in 2030, in 2040, in 2050? And that's where, as Eamon came in, they no longer think about buildings as just build it and bugger off. It's a whole life cycle. It's a whole build it, operate it, and hand over a building that still maintains its value. And that's why that metric is important, that increasingly we got very good at measuring energy and reducing energy, like the amazing work by SCAI. We got good at actually doing that with ESRI at a district level and at a city level. But what's now become important is we have to first understand carbon, as in the Zero project. We have to measure carbon, and if we get those two right, we're in a good way, and then we have to reduce carbon. The third one is difficult, and that's where the carrot and stick comes in.
I think that's a good point, because I think if you look at the finance sector is a very interesting one, because there's been some very interesting examples that I'll just anecdotally add if you haven't heard about this. So if you look at a lot of the 2050 targets that have been set up by other industries, specifically the oil industry, and we've seen BP and Shell this year announce they're going to backtrack on their carbon reduction targets by 2030. And the result of that announcement by BP is twofold. First of all, the shareholders were happy, which is depressing. But in their AGM, the CEO of BP nearly got ousted by a vote by the shareholders. And that is because the pension funds, the global large pension funds, are now getting a lot of pressure from the general public, and I'm one of those people that go into my pension fund and clean it out every year to ensure there's nothing in there that's harmful, because they understand that people don't want to invest or have pension funds which invest in dirty practice. So the BPCO stayed in because the hedge funds wanted him to stay in because the hedge funds will make more money. But the pension funds tried to boot him out. And that's a really interesting sign to say that the finance industry, is starting to understand the needs of the general public because public opinion is shifting very quickly on this subject. So I totally agree. Chris, what's your thoughts about the barriers and...
So last night, I think you asked for us to be a bit controversial. I don't know whether it was the
Well,
Guinness.
you swear words, you can say whatever you want, really.
No, there's no need for profanity just yet. But in terms of taking a step back and looking at the global picture of how countries run, my general sense of it is that the current global economic system is completely broken.
Agreed.
Okay, so for as long as capital is king and investment is king, then greed remains top of the agenda for politicians, for CEOs, and in that context, we will find it, I think, increasingly hard to meet those targets because there's just not enough compelling regulation or legislation to move us away from this linear economy that we've been breathing for 200 years.
So you're promoting social revolution, is what you're saying?
Well, those are your words. But what we do know is that muscle memory is a real thing, and getting over our consumption-based approach to, the fact that we still use GDP as a primary measure of successful growth of a country is, frankly, not helpful anymore. It just genuinely isn't helpful, is it? So, and yet we still do it.
Okay, yeah, because there was an interesting debate literally this week because US is obviously, in Biden's anti-inflation act, has managed to reduce inflation and their GDP is now per capita double of Europe average. So this huge debate online, Americans versus Europeans, who has best quality of life. Now, there's argument that, yeah, cool guys, you have great GDP, but if you're ill, it's not great.
Yeah.
So you are totally right. It is quite a weird way to discuss.
And for as long as GDP rules the way that financial institutions and governments think about prosperity and growth, especially in the middle-income countries who are seeking to follow our ridiculous example, right? Then the current economic system will continue. And that in itself will mean that we will fail to meet many of the targets that have been set out. And in that way, counting carbon, as altruistic and as absolutely important as it is, will probably not get the column inches, and people will only, if you ask, let's ask this audience, right? You need to stop driving your cars tomorrow. You in?
I don't own a car, so I'm in.
Great. Okay. So, not counting you, because you
cheating.
work for these guys.
That's cheating.
Right. How many? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. So we've got 14 people in the room, and 3 people put their hand up.
It's like that cartoon, right? It's that very famous cartoon. I think it went around during the last COP. The cartoon is, who wants to see change? Who wants to change?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's kind of the situation that we're in from a governmental kind of personal responsibility perspective. I think we understand what. So
we know that we need to count carbon because we're running out of time to prevent massive global catastrophes.
So it's a stick then. Not a carrot. It's a stick.
How can it be a carrot?
It's a stick. So the stick
it's a
is
great
then
philosophical question. How can it be a carrot?
How can it be a carrot? Well, I mean, if you take Denmark, obviously Cosmos, you're a Danish organisation, and let's talk about Denmark as a case study for a moment. For those of you that don't know, Denmark as a country enforced carbon counting on new builds as of the 1st of January this year. So to submit for planning in all of Denmark, you have to submit an estimate of your embodied carbon. Now, that's not a carrot. That's a stick, right? Would you agree?
That's a stick, but it's an overnight implementation of a regulation that was 8 years in the process. So they started first by saying, this is what life cycle assessment means. This is what carbon means. And they set out guidelines that everybody could follow and do it consistently and accurately. And then they said, here's a voluntary standard that you can follow. And then they built a software tool in year 3. You know, in year 4, they made people fill out that software tool and report. And then they learned from that. And then they said, how would you feel about a certain target? If we set a certain target, like, you know, a C rated, how would you feel about doing that? And they collected that data. And in year 4, then they brought out the draft regulations. You know, so it was a whole process. It happened over many years. And really, we haven't hit stage 1. We haven't defined what life cycle assessment is. Now, there's a lot of work being done. SCAI are hiring people in that role, and the Irish Green Building Council are doing a huge amount of work in taking 30 buildings and trying to standardise that. But it's 8 years to do that. But it has had a fundamental change on how they actually start to design buildings, because from the very outset, carbon is a consideration. And the form, the location, and the materiality of a building are first principles. So, you know, when you design a building, you can't really get to pre-tender stage and say, we're going to change this building from a concrete building to a steel building or maybe to a mass timber building. That has to be done from the outset. So it changes the whole process and procedure. So it is about the behavioural change. It is about getting everyone involved. Like, what happens in Ireland if you change your building from concrete to timber? The fire engineer says that won't work and you have to go back to start. What happens if you change a building to actually be leaner and have a different, you know, have a completely different aesthetic? You've got planning regulations. So all of this is risk, and we're very risk averse. So how do we change our construction practices to be more Danish? How do we Copenhagenize our processes? You know, so can we front end everything? And to front end everything, it's a time investment. It's also an emotional investment that you got to bring everyone with you. And the time investment means what client wants to pay for all this exploratory design for a low carbon, efficient, socially equitable building to be built, you know, when at the first hurdle they might be told, see all this work you've done, see all this 100 grand you've given to each consultant, put it in the bin and start again and give me something more traditional. That's the risk.
Sorry, yeah. No, look, I think there's a lot to be said in terms of the need for regulation, and I think it is fair to say that, like, the Danish model is a very good example of how to do it. The new, I suppose in Europe, the new EPBD that's due out before the end of this year, which will obviously informs the Part L for all the different countries in terms of energy efficiency within their regulations. That at the moment there's a draft version there that suggests that every building over 2,000 metres squared, every new build is going to need to have a whole life cycle embodied carbon calculation carried out from 2027. And that every building from 2030 is going to need that. But I suppose, to your point as well, the amount of work, yeah, I suppose the realities are, because of the amount of work that it takes, like even the methodologies, for example, and even the database of equipment, the database of material.
It doesn't exist today.
Yeah.
It's not there.
So 2027 is obviously even challenging at that, and 2030. But like I think it's important when you stand back and look at the actual volume of work involved. Like even now, I suppose the kind of, if we throw the circular economy in on top of this as well, just for the crack, like yeah, like you've got, so for example, CIBSE, to be fair, the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers, like they have it's called a TM66, and so they've picked lighting as an example of how you would create. So they've essentially created a whole application process for a lighting manufacturer to get a rating, a circular economy rating on their light fitting. So this could be, you know, so for example, you know, can the ballast be taken out and put, and LEDs, like the main problem with LEDs obviously is at the moment essentially Like at least when you had fluorescents, you went back and you changed the bulbs. LEDs, as soon as they're gone, they're dropped and they're taken out and thrown, and they're getting cheap. And the problem is that the cost of them is getting lower and lower. So the need, like when they were expensive, people were complaining about it. But the fact that the cost is getting lower and lower, the incentive to figure out how you're gonna, I don't have to replace all these people, are just clearing the whole floor through preventative maintenance and filling the whole floor with new LEDs. So, but that's an example. So that's one product that they're starting looking at a way of allowing people to get it certified as to it's circular, and it's a really impressive element. But that just gives you an example. So concrete and steel and things like that are one thing, but once you get into services equipment, the work involved in doing that is massive. But
well, I mean, and you're totally right, because I mean, during my presentation first, we spoke about the 12%, right? So globally, construction consumes 12% of all of the carbon tickets, and that's new construction, right? But then if you look at the existing buildings, which at the moment, by 2050, we've already built 90% of the buildings that will exist by 2050, right? So it's a huge stock. 10%, by the way, is an absolute shed load. It's a New York City a month between now and 2050 that we're going to be building globally. But that 90% at the moment remains 28% of all global emissions are powering, cooling, heating, maintaining our existing building stock. So the built environment as a whole is 40% of all carbon emissions. Now, of course, the power system has partially to do with that, but it's also, as you just said, the way we maintain buildings and what we do with the old stuff as well. As we know right now in the UK, they're having a bit of a schools crisis with aerated concrete. We won't get political why that is. I've already had that discussion in the pub last night. But to move on, Chris, I mean, do you agree with kind of like the sentiment from Archie and Eamon on like?
Yeah, I mean, it has to come down to either regulation or some form of pricing, doesn't it? It has to come back and hit people. Otherwise, there's no incentive to do it. So owner-occupiers, governments have to require a zero-carbon approach from the supply chain, because otherwise the designers and engineers won't design to those standards. So the tragedy of it is that the AEC industries, and it's an observer's viewpoint, it's still run on the same economic model.
Yep.
Now, Ramboll's a great example. Danish company, right? Ramboll's a great example, taking a sustainable approach to their design and leading with it and taking that as a differentiator to market. So, no, we won't just answer the client's brief. We'll go back and we'll propose a more sustainable approach.
Which is the right way.
Which is how things should be. Exactly, and that's why they're such a great co. I love Ramboll. But it takes that, it started by two environmentalists, so it's right through the lifeblood of that organization. So there, the power model is different because they start with environmental stewardship. They're not starting from a point of economic success. They're starting from a point of stewardship. So either we have to brain transplant all of the city mayors and the infrastructure owners so that they have that same embedded environmental mindset, or we've got to go through a very rapid process of mind shift to help them to think about their infrastructure differently than just the common economic model.
No, I totally agree. And
there's a question from the floor.
Good, there is a question. I was just about to come out, Ross, about a question to the floor. You beat me to it. So we have a question from the floor. Do you want to shout it or more of a comment? This is Ross from Cosmos.
It's more of a comment, really. It's about your carrot and stick analogy. There is no carrot. The stick is here, and the stick is going to get bigger. And we're going to be beat really hard over the next decade with a bigger stick, more legislation in order for this to work. Because 2027 is gone, we're never going to make it. 2030, forget about it, and it'll be, can we actually make 2050? That's the big question.
Are we at cricket bat size yet? Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, perhaps, yeah.
The other logarithmic growth of the stick is all of the other stuff that we're doing to the natural environment beyond carbon. So I know we're here to talk about decarbonisation, but carbon myopia is a big problem. in everywhere. So we're not connecting, and this is the thing about my geography brain, is that we need to do better to connect the cause and effect of everything that we do. So simply decarbonising isn't going to solve all the problems, because we will still get increased weather events. We will still have increased displacement of population. So the stick is going to get bigger, and it's kind of good news that there's more extreme weather events. I mean, how ridiculous is that to say? Why is it good news? Because it's one of the things that will drive people to change. It creates the compelling circumstances.
Although there was a hilarious comment by one of the British Conservative MPs that did say, well, it would be nice for it to be a little bit warmer in the UK, which is I mean, there are swear words that I could say, which I'm not going to say on public record as this is being brought. But I totally agree. We have another question or comment in the audience?
Okay, it's more of a comment, also like Ross, right?
A bit closer to the mouth.
Okay. So I understand the challenge that we are facing, and I personally believe that one of the biggest challenges is also related to illiteracy. People don't know sufficient about it. So the moment that people will know more, they will also be more aware, and that will drive positive change, I believe. But I don't think that... I would like to ask you as an expert, do you believe that we have really done everything that we can to work on the positive side of the carrot? Give an example, for instance. My country, in Portugal, statutory approval could take up to 4 years to secure for a particular project. If someone has the willingness to make a change, to create incentives that will actually make it worth it for the ones that are investing, and say, you know what, if you're going to be carbon negative, actually, your building is going to take a particular special path of approval, and we'll guarantee that you get approval in 3 months. Or on taxes, whatever. Because I think there's a lot of work that can be done on the side of the carrot. Because as you were saying, it's like, there needs to be initiative. So why don't we work more on that?
Great question. Yeah, like that's certainly the case. I suppose all my kind of comments earlier were probably from my cynical M&E consultancy days. So I suppose I'm my alter ego now. So in SEAI, like it is a fact. I think you need to be. I think the commercial sector, I suppose, we look at it as a kind of just a large behemoth, and there's no people involved. But obviously there are people, but that's their job. But on the other side, when I've been dealing with SEAI, when I've been working for SEAI, you start to look at it in a different, like we have a whole, environmental accountancy side of things, and a whole social, calculation element where we kind of look at exactly what you're saying, like what's the sweet spot with people, what's going to trigger there, and like that's. For example, so we have things, so there's education, there's planning, so all of which is free, and then there's grant funding for the works themselves. But even the way you speak to people, so we don't mention carbon. Everything we've talked about, and even now in SEAI, is energy efficiency, because you need to, like people, and especially in Ireland, I suppose, to talk about the whole idea of the worst weather. The problem we have in Ireland is, I suppose, some people, similar to your English politician, there's people saying, we'll probably be able to, make wine in Cork in the next 10 years or something like this. So there's a kind of that driver isn't really in this country. But I think we do need to, like, really, I suppose the sweet spot is, and to your point, for example, so we have a thing called the ACA, which is every renewable element, whether it be solar panels that's on that register, you get accelerated capital allowance, so a company can write off all the tax off that particular piece of kit in the first year. Then you have the grant system, which is obviously, so there's grants for solar panels, heat pumps, all sorts of different things like that. But I think what we need to be conscious of as well, and I've realised with the commercial sector, even more than the domestic, people's buildings are very different to, you can have somebody really conscious about their home, and, it's not like, I suppose I kind of liken it to someone, people don't, necessarily fully change their mindset. They kind of are who they are sometimes in their home, and it's like when you'd be trying to, and then they get into their car that possibly is just a diesel car, and go to an office that could be shocking in terms of energy efficiency. But it's nearly, people need to start thinking about things, carbon reduction, like weight loss reduction, if you know what I mean. Like if you're trying to lose weight, you can't just eat nicely in your house and then get into your car and eat whatever you want and then go to your work. Yeah. So that's the kind of, so I think to your point, you're totally right. But the problem is there's a reality there that there's an element, early adopters that will take it. There's the people who the grant funds will do. But there comes a point, to your point in regard to the stick, the reality is, and it's not, and people can do these things, but the problem is, until, like, if you've a small supermarket owner, you know, and, you know, the planet, I know there was a thing later on about health and safety, you know, can we relate to health? Like, it's too big for a lot of people's heads, if you know what I mean. Like, and that's why we go for the energy. If it's out there, like, it's miles away, like, you know. So the milk delivery is late, Mary's after calling in sick, the butcher's after cutting his hand, and the health and safety officer just walked in the door. And we're saying, you know, we should really think about the planet. And he's thinking, what are you on about? You know, so that's why in SEAI we're kind of really going to the point of, you know, this is good for you. We need to wrap it in a way that it's good for them. Do you know what I mean? And we don't need to convert them. We need to tell them. And like, the amazing thing is, there's a lot of people who we've given one grant to for something, and it was purely based on financial. And after that, they start getting excited then, and they're like, God, I can't believe I'm after saving that much money. And then they kind of, just the fact that they're gasping, once something happens, then it's real to them. But you can't start off with the planet, I think is.
Yeah, it's a good point that it has to resonate with people. It has to have meaning. But we are in an emergency and we are in a crisis. But even going to the room here, who knows their own carbon footprint? Can you put a number on that? Showing off again.
Sorry. 2.7 tons a year.
Yeah, but until you drank all that beer last night.
Oh, damn it, it's now 5 tons.
So I suppose we have to understand, like, why do we build? Why do we design? Why do we, you know, we enjoy what we do. We feel it has purpose. It contributes. And when we look at that, we see, okay, we want a better built environment. We want more joyful spaces. We want more functional spaces. But we also want a better future for our kids, you know, and the next generation. And, like, I've been in rooms with investors and fund managers that are investing in this, and they say, you know, in reality, my job is to speculate. It's to turn someone's money into, you know, at least not make it smaller. That's the trick. I'm not doing this for esoteric reasons, but I have to think about that. So are we building for profit? And we have to, or are we building for other agendas? But we do have to think about those other aspects, you know, that at the larger scale, the more macro stuff that's important. And we'll start to see over the next few years that things like social capital, you know, which you're also counting, resilience, you know, can you actually design in nature-based solutions that will make that building less susceptible to overheating, less susceptible to flooding, and protect that investment. So I think a lot of that is just really changing that mindset and re-educating people. And I thought that's why the questions about literacy and understanding are important. And it all does come back to that. But we can't, you know, you have to state that it has to happen now. And I think it's impossible. It goes back to this thing about the measurement, the metrics and the cost. You can't control what you can't manage, and you can't manage what you can't measure. And if you can't put a number on something, you know, you can't really influence, you can't change the dial. So that's the way we have to think about it, is we've got to have numbers on everything. And just going back to, there's a serious lag in the carrot in Ireland. It takes time to come through European directives, national directives. You have to test the socioeconomics of it, test it with the industry, and then give a kind of a flag fall of a year or two to bring it in. We don't really have that time. So maybe what we could do is work with people to see, can we take the lessons from Denmark? There used to be a joke about Irish regulations where they would Tipex out the crown and put in a harp. But maybe we can do that for Denmark as well. We can Tipex out the flag and put in our own flag,
Your point is absolutely well made. We have to have best practice now, and we have to promote the crap out of it, because the rest of us who are the other countries that are not behaving in the way that Denmark is, and some other countries as well, to be fair, but the vast majority of countries are not moving fast enough towards either carbon counting or other sustainable development practices in order for us to keep up with the challenge that's coming. Urbanization is increasing every year. Global population, we had the 8 billionth child born on the planet 2 years ago. Population growth ain't stopping, but desertification isn't stopping either. Sea level rise is gonna happen. And unfortunately, I do think that some of these triggers will only happen because of the extremes that we're seeing in climate change.
I totally agree. Like, shamelessly plugging Zero here as your carbon literacy partner, of course, which is why we exist. But no, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, mass urbanization will continue to happen. I mean, it will continue to happen as well. For those who are in the audience online, and I love this conversation. So if you know anybody at home or in your personal life that is more right-wing politically aligned, this is going to be controversial, right? You ready for this? Right? Generally speaking, those people are anti-immigration, right? I mean, and right now across the world, especially in the UK, they have this big thing about boats coming across. In Europe, we have a lot of kind of conversations about immigration, and immigration being caused right now by wars, and unpolitical flavors across the world. If you think it's bad now, you wait until everything heats up and you can't grow crops anymore. The UN have already estimated that there have been at least 15 to 25 million people who have immigrated solely for global warming reasons. And that is that their farms no longer can produce crops, or they can no longer really sensibly survive with their children in the houses that they're provided for because it's too hot, and therefore, where are they heading? North or south, away from the middle. So that urbanization question will actually increase in theory, because in theory we're going to have to...
Billions of climate refugees.
We will have to become a lot more denser in the areas in which it is habitable for us to live in.
There was an amazing bit of cartography, so it's the map geek talking again, okay. But there was an amazing bit of cartography done, and it was published in the Washington Post. I don't know the full story behind it, but I encourage you to go have a look at it, because it's a really interesting piece of research. The basic thesis was, if we do nothing globally now, as it relates to our ways of living and the way that we construct buildings, and our flood defenses don't get any more robust, this is your pub quiz, right? In how many years from now do you think the whole of Vietnam will be underwater?
Any guesses?
Who wants to have a guess? 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years?
17.5 years.
It's very specific. Anybody else want to
Anybody
have a guess?
else want to have a guess?
When you think Vietnam, the whole of Vietnam is going to be underwater. It's a really low-lying country, if you didn't know. It's crazy low-lying.
It's like
It's like the Netherlands, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone? Do you want to have a guess? 25?
Well,
Say again?
now we found somebody in the audience from Vietnam.
You're from Vietnam.
So you have to give.
So
no.
really
You have to give us a number.
Without sounding really dramatic, I really want you to look up this research, because it frightened the crap out of me when I read it. What do you think?
So what do you think?
If we carry on as we are,
A
with
number.
our heads in the sand.
20 years, he says.
7 years. 7 years, 1 billion climate refugees. Because Vietnam essentially becomes not uninhabitable. I'm not being really, it's not Don't Look Up, but it's pretty bloody close.
That's
it's
a very
getting
stressful
closer.
film if you've ever seen
It
that
is.
film.
It's a great film because it makes you think about this kind of stuff. And as I say, I'm not the author of the work, so I don't want to be saying that this is 100%, peer reviewed and whatnot. But just somebody doing that work to calculate that in 7 years, if we carry on as we are, then we're dealing with 1 billion climate refugees just from one country's flood defences, or lack of.
So I think we're going to wrap up now because it's approaching tea time here. Just want to say thank you to everybody in the audience who's passed comment. Thank you to Archie, Eamon, and Chris for joining us. These guys are going to be back later when we're going to be. Are we? They might be back later. We don't know. To discuss how we're going to pay for this, which we're going to go down the further line of kind of taxonomy, overcharging people stuff. Where is the money going to come from? In the meantime, it's break time here. So for those of you online, go and stretch your legs. We're going to stretch our legs here. Shamelessly plugging, come and join Zero because carbon literacy is fantastic and it's free. We've also got. I saw a message. There's Zero Waste with an X from Mayus, who's later. Anybody who's attending this has some kind of special offer to it. I don't quite understand, Mayors. I do apologise for that. And just a big thank you. And we hope you've enjoyed this session and do come back to the best stage. And finally, if you're still watching, I just forgot about this. Apparently, you can vote for the best stage and the best speaker of the day. And it goes without question that you should be voting for me. Okay? It's not even a conversation. So please, I don't know. Is there a prize? Do I win something? Do I win something? There's no praise like self-praise. Sponsors can't win. Yeah, but I don't have any money, so I haven't actually paid. But does that count? Is that okay? Okay, I'm through. Anyway, gentlemen, thank you much. Audience, thank you much. Online, thank you much. We'll catch you up in half an hour. Thank you.